All right, today we're jumping into a text that honestly had a huge impact on modern history. We're looking at the prologue to the 5th chapter, or Sūrah, from Sayyid Qutbs in the Shade of the Quran. Now, this text unpacks a really powerful and, frankly, uncompromising vision of faith, law, and society. If you want to get a grip on a big part of 20th century thought, you've got to understand what's being argued here. So let's dive right in.
So, here's how we're going to tackle this. We're essentially going to follow the author's train of thought through 4 main ideas. First up, we'll get into why he argues that God is the one and only true judge. Then, we'll see what this divine law is supposed to look like in the real world. After that, we'll look at how this creates a pretty distinct community. And finally, we'll explore the idea that this is it, the final perfected religion. And it all leads to a really big question at the end.
Okay, so let's start with the absolute foundation. This is the core idea that everything else in the text really hinges on. It all comes down to one question: who has the ultimate authority?
And wow, he does not waste any time getting to the heart of it. This one sentence is pretty much the bedrock of the entire argument. The idea here is that faith isn't just some private feeling you have in your heart. Nope, it's something you actively demonstrate by using God's law as the only standard for judgment. So, if you reject that law, it's not just a mistake or a sin, it's seen as a complete rejection of belief itself. To really wrap your head around that last point, you have to understand how Islam is being defined here. Linguistically, it means submission. And we're not talking about a partial submission, like on weekends or something. This is framed as a complete and total self-surrender to God's will. What that means is that nothing, not your personal life, not society, not politics, is considered outside of God's authority.
Okay, and this leads to a really radical rethinking of what Godhead even is. The argument goes like this: the power to make laws isn't just something God does, it's part of what God is. It's an essential quality of divinity, just as much as, say, creating the universe. So, from this point of view, if any human being or group tries to make their own laws, they're basically trying to steal a fundamental attribute that belongs only to God.
And the text presents this as just simple logic. The thinking is, if you believe God created everything and owns everything, then it just naturally follows that only God has the right to set the rules for that creation. It's like the Creator gets to write the Constitution. So any attempt by humans to make laws is framed as a kind of rebellion against the way the universe is supposed to work.
All right, so that's the foundation. Let's build on that. If God is the only one who can make laws, then what do those laws actually cover? What does this look like in day-to-day life? Well, the text makes it super clear that we're not just talking about a few spiritual guidelines. This is presented as a total, all-encompassing system. We're talking everything from what you eat and drink, to marriage, to how worship works, all the way to things like criminal justice, how to punish theft, and even how nations should interact. In this view, there's no wall between religious life and everyday life. It's all one integrated system. And the text draws a really sharp line in the sand here. It sets up a stark contrast. On one side, you have God's law, which is presented as perfect, totally impartial, and serving everyone with absolute justice. Then, on the other side, you have human law, and that's painted as being fundamentally flawed, biased, and always designed to benefit one specific group, whether that's a social class, a country, or even just one generation, at the expense of everyone else. And this is a really crucial point. The argument is that following a legal rule from God, well, that's just as much an act of worship as saying a prayer. They're put on the same level. So, you know that whole idea of separation of church and state? In this framework, that concept is completely meaningless. Law is worship, and worship is law. They're both just different ways of showing submission to God. So, if you have a whole community living by this all-in divine code, what does that community look like? What makes it unique? And what's its purpose in the world? Well, this vision gives the Muslim community a very specific job, to basically be the caretakers for all of humanity, with the responsibility of putting God's justice into practice. And what holds this community together isn't race or nationality or where you live. It's faith and faith alone. The ultimate loyalty is only to God, His messenger, and other believers. This creates a kind of global identity that goes beyond borders.
And there's this quote in the source text that really paints a picture of the ideal members of this community. It describes them as people God loves and who love God back, who are humble with fellow believers but proud and firm when facing unbelievers. They're driven to strive for God's cause, and they genuinely don't care what any critics have to say about them.
And, there's really no gray area here. The text is very direct. The community has to know who its enemies are. And how do you define an enemy?
Simple. It's anyone who rejects divine guidance and actively works against the system God revealed. So friends and enemies aren't determined by politics or nationality, but by one single question. Where do you stand on God's law?
Okay, this brings us to the final big theme of the argument, which is all about where this divine system fits into the grand scheme of history.
In this view, the Quran isn't just another holy book in a long line of them. No, it's presented as the final, definitive word from God to all of humanity. The idea is that it confirms the original truth in earlier scriptures, but also corrects any changes or distortions that humans introduced over time. So it effectively supersedes everything that came before, setting up the final, ultimate version of God's law for everyone forever.
And this particular verse, which the author quotes, is basically seen as the final seal on this whole argument. The declaration that God himself has perfected the religion. Well, that's taken as a divine guarantee that the system is complete. It's finished. It doesn't need any more human tweaks or updates.
So if you follow that logic, the conclusion is pretty clear-cut. If the system is already perfected by God, then any human attempt to change it or amend it or improve upon it is a massive contradiction. It's basically implying that God's work wasn't quite good enough, which from this perspective is the same as rejecting the faith entirely. Okay, so let's pull all these threads together now and land on a final, thought-provoking question. So, if we were to boil down the entire argument of this text, it's this. Faith and law cannot be separated. Faith isn't just a belief, it's an active, all-in submission to a complete social and legal system from God, a system that is presented as perfect, final, and absolutely not up for debate.
And that leaves us with the big question that really sits at the heart of this work. What are the implications for a society when its laws are seen not as agreements made between people, but as direct commands from God? What does that do to ideas of governance, of freedom, and of how different cultures and nations interact? It's a huge question, and this text gives one very powerful and very uncompromising answer.